Why did Orbán still lose despite strong backing from the US, Russia, and China? Here is Jersey's news commentary channel. Orbán has finally fallen. This was not a narrow loss, nor a technical defeat. He was completely crushed by the Tisza Party, led by Péter Magyar. More fatally, his opponent did not just win by a little, they won a two-thirds supermajority. This result tells all of Europe one thing: Orbán, this old political manipulator and mafia-style boss who ruled for years through media control, nationalist mobilization, blocking the EU externally while suppressing institutions internally, was not unbeatable after all. Hungarian voters proved one thing with their ballots: no matter how skilled one is at manipulating fear, packaging sovereignty, and turning the state machine into a tool of private power, the day will still come when the Hungarian people decide to settle that historical bill. What makes this election especially striking is that Orbán was not fighting alone. Behind him stood three very different outside forces: the American right wing of the Trump camp, Putin's Russia, and China, which has long treated Hungary as a breakthrough point into Europe. The American side was the most naked, and the most shameless. Vance flew directly to Budapest to campaign for Orbán, openly calling on Hungarians to stand with Orbán, and even calling him the only sane man in Europe. Trump, through phone calls and video messages, gave high-profile endorsements, calling Orbán the greatest leader in Europe, and saying, "My administration is always ready to use the full economic strength of the United States to strengthen Hungary's economy." This was no longer ordinary diplomatic goodwill. This was open intervention in the election of a friendly country, a blatant interference in another nation's internal affairs. Because in the eyes of Trump and Vance, Orbán is not just an ordinary ally. He is their most successful political model in Europe: anti-immigration, anti-liberal, anti-Brussels, controlling the media, rewriting institutions, all while concentrating power under the banner of defending civilization. As long as Orbán remained in power, MAGA had one more showcase exhibit: look, right-wing populism can not only win, it can rule for the long term. Russia, on the other hand, valued him mainly for his geostrategic utility. What pleased the Kremlin most about Orbán inside the EU over the years was not simply that he was a pro-Russian friend, but that he was the man who could hold up EU consensus. He long opposed or delayed military aid to Ukraine, sanctions on Russia, and energy decoupling. He also frequently leaked major EU decisions to Russia in advance, practically becoming a Russian mole planted inside the European Union. Most recently, he had been blocking a €90 billion EU loan package for Ukraine. For Moscow, Orbán's greatest significance was never propaganda. It was that he could create veto points, fractures, and noise inside the EU itself, preventing Europe from forming a unified will and moving in step at critical moments. So the moment Orbán fell, Russian hardliners immediately wailed in frustration, because they knew that Hungary's most crucial inside asset had collapsed. China's preference for Orbán was more a matter of structural calculation. Beijing has long regarded Hungary as a side door into Europe. Politically, Orbán often helped Beijing push back against EU criticism on human rights and rule of law. Economically, Hungary has in recent years become one of China's most receptive partners in Europe, especially in EV and battery investment. For example, he allowed BYD to establish a major factory in Hungary. Diplomatically, Beijing likes leaders such as Orbán who believe sovereignty overrides values, and cooperation overrides norms, because this helps weaken EU unity in using rules, human rights, and institutional standards to pressure China. This February, when Wang Yi met Orbán in Budapest, he still publicly praised Hungary's long-term friendly China policy and emphasized opposition to outside interference in Hungary's internal affairs. So Beijing clearly hoped Orbán would remain in office, continuing to serve as China's buffer, megaphone, and wall-breaking tool inside the EU. But the question is, if all three powers valued him so highly, why did he still lose? Because no matter how much foreign patrons praise you, they cannot replace domestic public anger. What truly defeated Orbán this time was not a few criticisms from Brussels, nor attacks from Western media, but the daily lives of Hungarians themselves. Reuters and AP both pointed out that the core factors crushing him were economic stagnation, the bitter consequences of inflation, deteriorating public services, accumulated corruption grievances, and growing international isolation. Young voters especially swung sharply toward the Tisza Party. Among the 18 to 29 age group, support for Fidesz had fallen shockingly low. In other words, Orbán's old tricks stopped working. 4 years he sustained his rule through identity politics, fear propaganda, and the narrative of foreign enemies. But when hospitals, schools, prices, wages, opportunities, and future expectations all began collapsing at once. Voters finally woke up from the so-called defense of civilization and returned to the far more urgent battle, the defense of real life and survival. There was another fatal factor. Orbán had turned himself into the spokesman of foreign powers. He had always packaged himself as the sole defender of Hungarian national interests, but by the late stage of the election, standing beside him was Vance, behind him was Trump, mixed into his political aura was Putin, and economically he was seen as Beijing's best friend inside the EU. This combination may have acted like a stimulant for part of his die-hard base, but for large numbers of centrist voters it had the opposite effect, a strong negative backlash. People increasingly asked, are you really representing Hungary, or are you using Hungary as a bargaining chip in your external deals? A man who constantly shouts against foreign interference welcomes the Vice President of the United States to personally campaign for him. A man who shouts about sovereignty ties his country to a pro-Russian line and external geopolitical projection. How could voters possibly miss this irony and contradiction? On a deeper level, Orbán's defeat had its historical inevitability. He began as a liberal youth who opposed communism, the Soviet Union, and dictatorship. Yet step by step he transformed into the poster figure of illiberal democracy, even outright authoritarianism. After 16 years in power, he packed the media, judiciary, election rules, state resources, business interests, and ideology into one single power machine. The EU therefore froze part of its funding to Hungary for years, criticizing the country's backsliding on judicial independence and press freedom. Such a system may look stable on the surface, but in reality it depends heavily on one condition: society must continue functioning efficiently, and living standards must keep improving. Once that foundation breaks, the entire legitimacy collapses. That is exactly where Orbán lost. He turned the national system into his private territory, but failed to make the national economy better. Why could Magyar win? The key was not that he was left-wing. On the contrary, he was not the kind of traditional liberal that naturally frightens ordinary conservative voters. He himself came from inside Orbán's own system. He understands Hungary's conservative nationalist narrative, and he knows how to bypass the most divisive culture war issues. Instead, he pulled the main battlefield back to anti-corruption, people's livelihoods, public services, and restoring relations with the EU, the areas ordinary voters feel most directly. He did not defeat Orbán by preaching anti-Hungarian nationalism. He defeated Orbán by raising a new banner, taking national interests back from Orbán. This move was devastatingly effective. So the backing from the US, Russia, and China, rather than helping Orbán, actually worked as a negative force. In reality, it backfired. For his hardcore base, it certainly offered some positive encouragement, but for swing voters and younger voters who determined the election, it became a political liability. Because it reinforced one impression: Orbán was no longer Hungary's future, but rather an old signboard of the global authoritarian populist alliance in Europe. Trump wanted to use him to prove MAGA could be replicated. Putin wanted him to keep sabotaging the EU. Beijing wanted him to preserve China's strategic opening into Europe. But the final answer from Hungarian voters was simple: you may all think he is important, but we are sick of him. We have had enough. So the moment Orbán fell, the EU erupted in celebration. For years he repeatedly weaponized the veto on Ukraine aid, Russia sanctions, and rule of law mechanisms, long making him one of Brussels' most troublesome figures. Now with Magyar in office, he may not instantly become Ukraine's most passionate supporter. He himself has clearly said he does not support Ukraine's fast-track EU accession, and some pragmatic space with Russia may remain. But as long as he no longer uses vetoes as weapons the way Orbán did, the coordination costs inside the EU will drop sharply. Germany has already made it clear it hopes Hungary's political change will quickly unblock that Ukraine loan package. In other words, what Europe has been waiting for is not an angel, but simply someone who no longer deliberately flips the table. That alone is enough for the EU to breathe a sigh of relief. The funniest and most meaningful part of Orbán's defeat is this: three great powers were all lifting the sedan chair, yet the chair still overturned in the end. Trump, Putin, and Beijing all thought they were betting on a historical strongman. In the end they discovered they had merely bet on an outdated, reactionary political troublemaker. Orbán once represented the proudest era of Europe's populist right. Now his downfall proves another truth: no matter how skillful authoritarian populism may be, once it turns the nation into a personal machine, diplomacy into a sabotage tool, and leaves people's livelihood crises unresolved for too long, it will eventually be settled by history. Orbán has fallen. Hungary may not transform overnight, and Magyar may not be a perfect figure either. But one thing is already crystal clear: the Orbán era, sustained by vetoes, fear, manipulation, and outside backing, has now completely ended. For the EU, for Ukraine, and for everyone who is sick of Europe being repeatedly blackmailed by one internal troublemaker, this is indeed a moment worth celebrating.